Or the worst thing is there are tyrants all over the world and they torture people for no cause, or maybe even just because they like torturing people. And that's an anomaly of a different order, right? It's not just that you're going from point A to B and something you don't like happens. It's more like there are some aspects of existence that look so terrible in and of themselves, associated with our vulnerability, that just apprehending them might be enough to knock the bottom out of your faith in any frame of reference. And that's a kind of Nietzschean theme. Nietzsche says, look, when you're going from point A to B and something bad happens, something you don't expect, you don't get to where you wanted to go. That's bad. But what's even worse is you can't have any faith in the frame of reference that you were using because it's been invalidated. But what's even worse is you plow your way through 2 or 3 frames of reference and then you start to develop some skepticism about frames of reference in general, right? So I was a socialist, say, and then I was a Catholic, and then I developed some New Age philosophy, and none of those really worked. And what that made me think was, well, you can't trust socialism, you can't trust Christianity, and those New Age people are certainly out to lunch. Maybe you can't trust any frames of reference. And that's a really devastating discovery, and Nietzsche associated that with the death of God, right? It's like, no frames of reference work. And then you have the problem that, well, without a frame of reference, life is chaos, and chaos is intolerable, and therefore, logically, life is intolerable. And I tried to make a case for you then, as kind of a side case, which was people protect their ideologies because they don't want to lose their frames of reference. They don't want to fall into chaos. But then there's this additional problem, which is that you can develop a kind of deep cynicism about life in a secondary manner, which is like constant loss of faith. Maybe what you conclude under those conditions, like the aggressive child concludes, is that fundamentally, I'm not to be trusted, you're not to be trusted, society is not to be trusted, and maybe the structure of the world as a whole isn't to be trusted, and therefore, logically, you're more or less obligated to work against it. And so then you have a nice sub-story for the propagation of evil, which is, well, we like to have our ideological frames of reference retained, and that gives us ample reason to squash anyone that's different. But then there's this additional reason, which is, when you get right down to it, things are pretty bloody awful, and maybe the sensible thing to do is to just work for the annihilation of things. And I think we've had endless examples of people who did precisely that in the 20th century, and almost got away with it, in case you're tempted not to take this sufficiently seriously, right? We know that Stalin, in all likelihood, who I think you could make a case for being, if not the most evil man that ever lived, certainly the most evil man that lived this century. And that's really a high honor, right? Because he was up against some really top contenders. We know, as a consequence of recently released KGB documents, that he was probably gearing up to start the Third World War, not one of these little half-rate, little local Third World Wars. We were talking about the whole H-bomb exchange thing designed to eradicate, the US for sure, but also the Soviet Union. And, well, mere territoriality isn't enough to account for that. But then maybe you can see Stalin's point, right? Like Tolstoy could see it. If life is really so awful at bottom, which there are perspectives from which that certainly seems to be the case, then why bother having it around at all?